Morning, how's it going? So I want to start with a question. Do you ever feel trapped by your circumstances? Do you ever feel enslaved to a certain way of life or a pattern of life that you just, you want to get out of, but you can't? Growing up, I was a wrestler. And it was a very big part of my life, actually. I started wrestling competitively when I was 4 years old. And I was kind of cute with my little singlet and everything like that. But it became a very big part of my life. And, I ended up competing on state and national levels. And, I traveled around going to different tournaments and different clubs. By the time I was in the 7th grade, I was actually starting on the varsity team in my high school. And by the time I was a sophomore in high school, I hated it. It was something that for most of my life I was really passionate about. I loved, I enjoyed, it was fun. But by the time I got to high school, the pressure of everything just got so overwhelming that I hated it. I really did. I dreaded every match that I have to go out and wrestle. I literally lost sleep. And it was just something that, it was sucking the life out of me. It got to the point my senior year of high school, I was the lead captain of the team, and so at the end of the year, I had to give a speech at the wrestling banquet. And I remember giving this speech and just looking out at the faces of horror on the kids and the parents as I compared wrestling to an abusive husband, because it just, continuously beats the crap out of you, and yet for some stupid reason you keep coming back to it. It was awful, I know. But this is how I felt with wrestling at this point. It was something that it was sucking the life out of me. I hated it, and yet never once did I ever consider stopping. It was just something that it wasn't an option on the table. I felt enslaved to it. I had to do it because of the expectations or whatever. I had to do it. Have you ever felt this way with anything? Have you ever been trapped by the circumstances in your life and feeling like you can't get out of it? I mean, it could be a relationship, maybe. This is one of the ways that I've experienced it in my life is in relationships, being in a relationship with somebody that you shouldn't be with. And you know this, but you've been with them so long that you just kind of let it go on. And so you feel trapped there. You feel like you can't escape. Or maybe it's just the busyness of life. Maybe your life is being pulled in so many different directions that you feel like you can't actually give time to the things that are most important, or you feel like you can never get a break, you can never get any rest. And yet at the same time, you don't think that there's anything you can let go of. It's all too important to let go of, and so you feel trapped, enslaved to these things. Maybe it's that you work 80-hour weeks and you never get to see your wife or your kids, and you feel like it would be nice to be able to do these things, but at the same time you have to pay the mortgage for the bigger house and the nicer neighborhoods with the better school districts, and you feel trapped in this lifestyle and you can't get out. And it's not something that's like awful, it's bearable. And so, because it's bearable, you just kind of suck it up and you deal and you say, well, that's life, and let it happen. Well, this is kind of where we find the Israelites in our text from this past week. If you guys have been following along in your chronological Bibles, the text from this past week, when we look into it, we see that the Israelites are enslaved in Egypt. But it's an interesting slavery, because most often when you think of slavery, when people end up in slavery, they end up there because a conquering nation comes in and they take them captive and bring them back as slaves, or there's a war or something and they're prisoners of war and they're put into slavery. But that's not how the slavery of the Israelites started in Egypt. The slavery of the Israelites started because they went into Egypt of their own volition. They went there, and it was a good thing when they went. It was actually a God-ordained thing. If you look in Genesis 46, God actually tells Jacob to take his family into Egypt and says, it's okay, I'll be with you and I will take you out again. So the Israelites go there, and it's a good thing. And very often, the things that enslave us in our lives, these things that kind of trap us in our lives, they aren't bad things. They're things that we initially go into because they are good. They are good for us, and they're things that we need to do. And over time, the situation changes, and then all of a sudden we find ourselves enslaved to them. And that's what happened with the Israelites. They're in Egypt, and at first it's good. Joseph is there, and he's well respected, and so they're treated well. But then Joseph dies, and Jacob dies, and the Pharaoh who knew Joseph dies, and then 400 years goes by. Next thing you know, they're actually slaves in this land. And the Egyptians are afraid of them because they're so numerous, and so they're starting to oppress them. and they're crying out. And as they're crying out, God hears their cry. If you guys have your Bibles, if you can open them up to Exodus chapter 3. God hears their cries, and he calls Moses. He appears to Moses in the flames of this burning bush. And many of you are probably familiar with this story. You've either seen the Charlton Heston version of the story or the Val Kilmer animated version of the story. And so you have an idea of what's coming. But God calls this guy Moses, and if you've been reading, then you kind of know this backstory a little bit. Let me give you it if you're not familiar. Moses is an Israelite who was raised as an Egyptian in Pharaoh's household. And as Moses got older, he went out one day and he saw that there was an Egyptian beating an Israelite. And so Moses stepped in and he took out the Egyptian. He actually killed them, then hid him in the sand, and then fled because he was afraid for his life. So he fled into the wilderness. And Moses has been living in the wilderness, shacking up with a family of shepherds for the past 40 years. And while he's there, God comes and appears to him in this burning bush. And Moses is intrigued by it. He goes and talks to God. And this is what God says. Chapter 3, verse 7. It says, "The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering." God's been with them the whole time. God knows what's going on. He's not this distant God who's just leaving them there. God sees their suffering, and he's concerned. God is concerned about their current state. God is concerned about your current state. If you are enslaved to anything, God is concerned for your well-being. John, I'm concerned about their suffering. So I've come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. And if you skip down to verse 13. Now, Moses is probably familiar with this God, but he was raised Egyptian. He doesn't really know all the things that the Israelites know. And so he goes, verse 13. Moses said to God, "Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you,' and they ask me, 'What is his name?' Then what shall I say to them?" God said to Moses, "I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you." God also said to Moses, "Say to the Israelites, 'The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name by which I am to be remembered from generation to generation.'" This is the first time in this grand narrative of the Bible that we actually see the name of God. Up until this point, God was referred to as the Almighty. And for the first time, God reveals his name. I am. I am. From here on out, the Israelites start to refer to God as Yahweh, which is a derivative of I am, which essentially means he is. And actually, if you look in your Bible, anytime God is referred to as the Lord, and Lord is spelled in all caps in your Bible, that in the original text, actually it has shorthand there for Yahweh. Because this is the name of the God of the Israelites. And so God gives this name to Moses so Moses can go and prove that he is going on behalf of the God of their forefathers, of the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And so Abraham, so God gives Moses some other instructions about going to Pharaoh and what to do. And then Moses and his brother Aaron go to Pharaoh to kind of stand out and do what God has called them to do, to rescue the people from the Egyptians. And Aaron goes with Moses because Moses is a little uncomfortable with public speaking, and so Aaron's his mouthpiece. And so in chapter 5, starting in verse 1, he says, "After Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, 'This is what the Lord, the God of Israel says, let my people go so they may hold a festival to me in the desert.' And listen to what Pharaoh says. So Pharaoh said, 'Who is the Lord that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go.'" And if you see there, it's the Lord with all caps. Moses goes to him and says, "This is what Yahweh says." And Pharaoh's like, "Yahweh? I don't know this Yahweh character. Who are you talking about? Like, well, I'm supposed to just, listen? I mean, I know lots of gods, but I've never heard of Yahweh." And, Pharaoh obviously says, leave. Get out of here. This is nothing to me. Yahweh means nothing to me. And this kind of brings us into the heart of the issue of our enslavement. It actually has to do with a knowledge of God. See, Pharaoh has a misunderstanding of who God actually is. He's ignorant of what God, the true God, is actually capable of. And so why is Pharaoh going to fear a God that he doesn't know? At the same time, the Israelites, they don't really know Yahweh very well either. You know, they know of him. They know that he's the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, but he's been kind of quiet for the last 400 years, and now they're in slavery. They haven't really seen him at work in their lives, and they don't really know who this Yahweh God is. This is the first time they're actually hearing his name. And so because they don't know him, they don't actually trust him. They aren't going to just like get up and take up arms against the Egyptians and, you know, trust that God is going to come to their rescue because they don't know him. So Moses and Aaron come, and they ask Pharaoh to let him go. Pharaoh says no, and it's a huge failure because Pharaoh is actually offended by this. This is an affront to his authority. And so Pharaoh actually cracks down on the Israelites even harder, and he makes their workload increased and have their slave drivers, you know, work them even harder. And now the Israelites are, you know, their spirits are broken. And Moses is pretty bummed about the whole thing too, naturally. And he's a little confused. If you look in 5:22, it says, Moses returned to the Lord and said, "O Lord, why have you brought this trouble upon this people? Is this why you sent me? Ever since I went to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has brought trouble upon this people. And you haven't rescued your people at all." Moses is a little confused here. He's like, wait a minute. You called me out. I thought we had a deal here. I was going to go to Pharaoh, and he was going to let the people go. You were going to raise your mighty hand. This was all supposed to work. You haven't rescued your people at all. You didn't keep up your end of the bargain. And I love God's response to this in 6:1. It says, "And the Lord said to Moses, now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh. Because of my mighty hand, he will let them go. Because of my mighty hand, he will drive them out of this country." God's like, now it's on. Now I'm ready to play hardball. And it helps if you kind of picture God as like a professional wrestler, or that dude from the Jets who was interviewed after the Patriots game a couple of weeks ago, and he uses that, you know, screamy, sort of like intimidating voice, and he's like, with my right hand I'm going to squeeze them, my left hand I'm going to crush them, and they're going to beg you to leave. It really helps, right? You know, now you kind of get the picture. God is here, and God, he realizes that nobody knows who he is. Pharaoh doesn't fear him because Pharaoh doesn't know him. The Israelites don't trust him because they don't know him. So God is going to make himself known. He's going to have his own little coming out party, his own little cotillion, if you will, and he's going to let the world know who he is. And it starts when he reveals his name to Moses. And he tells Moses, I am. That is my name. I am. And now he's about to show the world what's in a name. He's about to show the world what the great I am is capable of. And it starts with a little magic trick. So Moses and Aaron, they come back to Pharaoh, and they're like, hey, let my people go. And they want to, you know, make sure that he knows he got a prop. Make sure that they know it means business, so they take their little staff and they throw it on the ground, and it turns into a serpent. And then the magicians, Pharaoh's magicians, they come and they throw their staffs on the ground and they make a serpent. And then Moses and Aaron's serpent eats their little serpent staffs, and it just seems weird, actually. It's like this bizarre display. Why is God doing this? Of all things that he could be doing, why is he having them make serpents out of staffs and having them eat? And it's actually not that random. God is sending a message to Pharaoh and to Egypt about his power, his authority. You see, the Egyptians believed that Isis was the goddess of magic. Yeah, meet Isis. Isis was the goddess of magic. That's where these sort of abilities came from. When the magicians came and they threw their stick on the ground and they turned into a serpent, they were calling on Isis for that power. Now, Isis, it was believed by the Egyptians, got her magical powers from the king of the gods, Ra, the sun god, and she got these powers from him by creating a serpent, a poisonous serpent that went out and it bit him. And he was on the verge of death with this poison in his body, and as he was about to die, Isis convinced him to give her his magical powers in exchange for a cure. This is where the Egyptians' magical powers come from. It comes actually originally from a serpent. And so Moses and Aaron, they're going to throw this stick down. They're going to create a serpent, and they're going to watch their serpent swallow the serpent of the magicians whole, swallowing up this whole theory that Isis is the goddess of magic. And God is going to make a statement here. God is going to make a statement that Isis isn't responsible for, creating miraculous things. And God is going to affirm his name to the Egyptians and to the Israelites. He's going to say, who's the God of magic? I am. Say that with me. Who's the God of magic? I am. I am. And then Pharaoh is not impressed because he sees the magicians do the same thing. And so he's like, no, I'm not going to let your people go. And then the plagues ensue. And you guys are probably familiar with the 10 plagues of Egypt. If you hadn't read it, you've at least heard about what's going on with the 10 plagues. Well, each one of these plagues, it does two things. One, it really irritates the Egyptians on a varying scale from annoying to lethal. But if that's all that they're about, it's, again, this weird display of events. Like, why these plagues? Why, these specific ones? It's weird. What was God thinking? But the reality is that with each plague, God is also attacking one of the gods of Egypt and dethroning their gods and proving his sovereignty. Now, just so you understand, religion in Egypt at this time in history is kind of like owning an iPhone, except instead of apps, they have gods. So, like, you name it, they have a god for that. Like farming, they have a god for that. Fertility, they have a god for that. Magic, they have a god for that. And so, when God sends these plagues, he's not just attacking the Egyptians, he's attacking the gods of Egypt. And it actually says in Exodus 12:12, God doesn't just say that he's going to bring down judgment on Egypt. He says, I will bring down judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am Yahweh, he says. And so the first plague comes along. Who's our first victim? We got Khnum. Here's Khnum. Meet Khnum. Khnum is the god of the Nile. And it was really embarrassing for him when Moses and Aaron took their little staff and they put it over the Nile and it turned to blood. Because, see, Khnum was supposed to ensure that fresh water came into Egypt. And when it turned to blood, the magicians, started to pray to Khnum to make it better, but it didn't get better. Because Khnum isn't the god of the Nile. God says, I am. One more time. God says, I am. Khnum isn't the god of the Nile. God says, I am. But the magicians are able to do something similar, able to turn water into blood or make it red or something along these lines. And so Pharaoh doesn't let the people go, so Moses and Aaron have to take out that handy-dandy staff of theirs again, and they raise it up, and this time God sends frogs. Lots and lots and lots and lots of frogs. Scary. I mean, I'd be terrified. Weird. Like, who's going to be afraid of frogs? They're kind of like slimy and stuff, but why frogs? And not just like one or two frogs, it's like massive amounts of frogs. But I'd like you to meet the goddess Hecht. Hecht is a lovely frog-headed goddess who loves taking long walks along the Nile and painting pyramids in her spare time. She's also the goddess of fertility, and she assists in childbirth. And actually was believed to give the breath of life to children in the birthing process. And a frog is the symbol of Hecht, this precious god. And God's just mocking them at this point. I mean, if you ever, wondered whether or not God has a sense of humor, now is the time to see it. God's just like, really? You're going to look to this little slimy green thing as your symbol of life and fertility? And he just pours them out all over the city. And then he doesn't get rid of them. He lets them die there and pile up in these heaps. But again, Pharaoh's not impressed because the magicians, they're able to call up frogs out of the water as well and into the city. And so he hardens his heart and he doesn't let the people go. And so they have to have another plague. And so this time, they raise the stakes a little bit. And Moses and Aaron, they raise that staff and gnats come into town. Gnats. which, I mean, how is gnats raising the stake? There's something really significant if you look in the text. If you go to chapter 8, verse 16, it says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Tell Aaron, stretch out your staff, strike the dust of the ground, and throughout the land of Egypt the dust will become gnats.'" Notice the way this is being talked about here. It's saying that the dust will become gnats. This isn't like the frogs where God called all these frogs out of the Nile and from around to come into the city, where there were pre-existent frogs coming into the city. Now all of a sudden, it's gnats appearing out of nowhere. It's dust turning into gnats. It's new life. It's spontaneous generation. I mean, Louis Pasteur would go crazy if he saw this happen because it would totally blow everything out of... So this is something that is huge. And this is an affront to Ammon. Ammon was the god who was known to be the giver of life, the creator of life. Nobody but Ammon should have the ability to make something that was dead, inanimate, into a living creature. And so when this happens, for the first time, the magicians aren't able to replicate it, and the magicians themselves say, this was the finger of God. They're starting to get it. They're starting to realize that Ammon isn't the God who is the author of life. He isn't the creator God. God says, I am. And then comes Geb. Geb that's the one on the bottom there. That's his wife, Nut on top. Yeah, his wife's a nut. So Geb's on the bottom there. Geb is the god of the land. And so what God does is he has Moses and Aaron raise that staff again, and swarms of flies come into town, and they start to cover the ground. And it says in chapter 8, verse 24, "And the Lord did this. Dense swarms of flies poured into Pharaoh's house and into the houses of the officials, and throughout Egypt the land was ruined by the flies." God destroyed the land. Where are you now, Geb? I thought you were supposed to be responsible for protecting this land. And God says, Geb is not the God of this land. God says, I am. I am. And then, next, Hathor, goddess of the livestock, who can't protect her livestock, her precious livestock in Egypt from dying by the next plague. Because Hathor isn't the god or goddess of the livestock. God says, I am. And then next we have Isis again. God sends boils. Isis was known as not only as the goddess of magic, but also the goddess of healing. God sends boils to afflict all the Egyptians. And the magicians, they can't make them go away. Because Isis isn't the god of healing. God says, I am. And then the people, Pharaoh's heart is still hard. He still won't let them go. Because there's still gods that need to be taken out of the picture. And so next we have Nut, the sky goddess. And God says, you're going to trust in Nut to hold up the sky? And God brings the sky crashing down in hail and lightning. Because he wants them to know that Nut isn't the goddess of the sky. Nut isn't in charge of the sky. God says, I am. And then almost everything in the land is destroyed. There's hardly anything alive left. But there's still some green. And that's unacceptable because as long as there's greenery in this land, they think that Seth is doing his job and that he's protecting their crops and their vegetation. So God says, I'm going to send locusts, and locusts come and they destroy everything. Not a green leaf was left in the land. The entire land was black, it says. And God makes it very clear that Seth is not the God of their crops and their vegetation. God says, I am. Now, everything's pretty desolate in the land. There's no life. The livestock's dead. The crops are gone. They're pretty hopeless. And yet, Pharaoh, his heart is still hardened. He's not going to let them go. So God does something very interesting. He makes it dark for a few days. And it's weird because, you know, as far as affliction goes, you'd think that darkness would have come before, like, boils. Because this, unless you're 3 years old and afraid of the dark, shutting out the lights for a few days, it's not that scary. You light a candle or something. But God makes it dark. And on the first day, people start to get a little worried. Because the most powerful god in the Egyptian hierarchy of gods is Ra, the god of the sun. He was their Zeus, compared to the Greek gods. Ra was in charge. He was the head honcho. And so when the sun didn't rise that first day, they're praying to Ra. They're like, Ra, come on, we need you to show up. And then when the second day comes and it's still dark, they're like really starting to get scared. And like, Ra, come on, show up, please. And when the third day comes, they finally start to get the picture. There is no Ra. There is no Ra. All the powers that they attributed to Ra, they don't belong to Ra. They are gods. And God, this one final time, he says, Ra and all of your gods, they aren't in charge. They aren't responsible. God says, I am. And Pharaoh's ready to let the people go. But then last minute, his heart is hardened again. And he decides that he's going to keep the Israelites one more time. Because there's still one God left in Egypt that has remained unchallenged. And this God is Pharaoh himself. In Egyptian religious beliefs or whatever at this time, Pharaoh himself was considered to be a deity. And he was connected with the god Horus. But as long as Pharaoh was alive, he thought that he was in charge. And actually, the way the whole story played out, it actually fed into Pharaoh's ego. Because if you realize, every step of the way, Moses and Aaron come representing God, asking Pharaoh's permission. Asking Pharaoh. So Pharaoh thinks he's calling the shots still. He still believes that he's the God of this land. There's a little dramatic irony here, because if you read the text, you realize that God actually hardened Pharaoh's heart and was influencing his own decisions. But Pharaoh still thinks he's the head honcho, and so God needs to deal with this one last God. And so God comes down, and he brings death upon the people, and he says, I'm going to take the life of every firstborn male in your household, every firstborn of your cattle. No one is safe. And so God comes, and at midnight he strikes them, and the first one that's listed among the dead says Pharaoh's own son, who sits on the throne. Right before Pharaoh's eyes, God killed Pharaoh. Pharaoh's son was also Pharaoh. And God killed him right before his eyes, making it very, 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 very clear. Pharaoh, you are not the God of this people. God says, I am. And Pharaoh finally relents, and he lets the Israelites go, lets them be free. Whatever it is that might be enslaving you in life, whatever is trapping you, whatever the circumstances might be, there are always a number of false gods that are behind that. A number of false gods that, if you're ever to be free from it, have to be dethroned by God himself. God has to come through and tear down these false gods. And so maybe, if it's a relationship or something that you're struggling with, God's going to have to come through, and he's going to have to show you that your identity isn't in this other person. They aren't the source of your identity. God has to say, I am. And if you're dealing with financial issues, or you're enslaved to your finances, God's going to have to come in and say, your security, it doesn't come from your finances. That's not your source of security. I am. And if it's an addiction or something that you're dealing with, God will have to come in and show you that whatever it is, the substance or the behavior that you're addicted to, that isn't what's going to bring you joy and happiness and peace in life. God says, I am. And God will have to, one by one, tear down the gods that are enslaving you. Because it's never just a circumstance. There's always false gods behind the circumstances that enslave us. And so God has to come through and tear them down. And last but not least, God will always have to tear down us. Because just like he had to do with Pharaoh, just like Pharaoh was the last God that had to be torn down, we are the last God that has to be torn down if we're ever to experience this freedom. Because we actually do deify ourselves. We think that we are the gods of our lives. We think that we're the ones who can free us from whatever is enslaving us. And whenever we think this way, one of two things happens. Either we look at the circumstances, we look into ourselves to try to find our freedom, and we realize we don't have what it takes. We look around and realize we don't have what it takes, so we just settle, and we kind of give in, and we say, oh well, I guess I'll just have to live with the circumstances, and we suck it up and deal. Or two, we don't realize that we don't have what it takes, and we try to take up arms against these false gods, and we're destroyed by it. Either way, you still end up in slavery, and your spirit is broken. But God has to tear that down and point out the reality that we aren't the gods of our lives. We aren't our own saviors. God is. God is. We have to rely on Him to bring us out and bring us into freedom. This is where this parts ways with a lot of the kind of pop culture, self-help philosophies that you'll find in this world. Because they're going to tell you that you are a strong and empowered individual and that you can overcome whatever adversities come in your life. Any of you watch Friends, TV show Friends? Yeah, I know it's not on the air anymore, but I still watch it. I saw an episode a couple weeks ago, and Chandler was trying to quit smoking, and Rachel, found out about this, and she's like, "Oh yeah, my friend used this hypnotic tape. Just play it when you go to sleep, and it'll work really well for you." She listened to it for 2 weeks, and now she's like done smoking. So he's like, "Yeah, I'll try it." So he puts on the tape, and you see him going to sleep, and he falls asleep into this deep sleep, and the tape starts running. And it's like, you are a strong individual. You don't need to smoke. You are a strong, empowered woman. You don't... Obviously, it was a woman who used the tape before this, and so it actually worked really well. He was able to stop smoking, but he did start to get concerned why his hips looked big in his pants and everything like that. But this isn't the sort of teaching that we're dealing with here. It's not that you are a strong, empowered individual that you can overcome all of life's obstacles. It's not that you are greater than the gods that enslave you. It's that God is greater than the gods that enslave you. God is greater than the gods that enslave you. And that's why it's so important that there's this parentheses right in the narrative of the plagues. In the text, it talks about the Passover. And the Passover, what's interesting is it comes right during the last plague, when death comes down upon the people. All of the other plagues, if you read the text, you realize that the Israelites were safe from the other plagues. They were living in the district of Goshen, and they were actually safe there. God kept them away from whatever disaster. And with this last plague, God says, no, it's coming to everyone. Nobody is safe. The only thing that will save you is if you follow these instructions. And so he tells them to kill a lamb or a goat, and to take its blood and to put it on the doorposts of their homes. And when God came into town, he would see the blood on the doorposts, and he would pass over those houses. And the people in those homes would be saved. Because the only thing that could set them free wasn't that they were Israelites, wasn't that they were in Goshen. It was the blood of the Lamb covering them. The Passover was a shadow of what's to come. It was a shadow of the work that Christ would do on the cross. For us, if we're looking to experience freedom, the only thing that can set us free is the blood of the Lamb. If you're trying to find freedom from your circumstances in life without first being covered by the blood of the Lamb, you will always be brought down. You will always be kept in bondage. But if you put your faith in Christ and the blood of the Lamb covers you, then you're free from sin and death, and there's nothing that should enslave us anymore. There's nothing that should be able to keep us down. And yet, there still are these things. And so we have to step out in faith, knowing that the God who brought the Israelites out of Egypt, that God will come and rescue us if we're willing to step out in faith. But it's scary. It is. I'm not gonna lie. It's scary to step out in faith because you have to trust entirely on God, knowing that you can't do it on your own. And if He doesn't show up, it's going to crush you. So it does take a lot. And to be candid, most of you probably won't do this, and most people don't do this because it is terrifying. So most people will kind of just live with the status quo in their lives and say, it's not great, but it's bearable. So I'm just gonna kind of continue along with it. But the reality is, one author put it so well, Mark Batterson. He's a pastor down in D.C., and he wrote a book recently. But he said, when we don't have the guts to step out in faith, then God is robbed of the glory that rightfully belongs to Him. See, when we say, it's too much. I'm actually just going to live with the status quo. We rob God of his glory. When we do that, what we're saying is that, God, I don't trust you to come through. And many of us don't trust God to come through because we've never seen him actually work in our lives in this way. We've never actually seen him come through and do miraculous things in our lives because we never give him any latitude to work in our lives. We're so controlled about everything that we do, we never actually leave room for God to show up and save us. And as long as we're constantly, controlling everything, we aren't going to see God work like this. But if we step out in faith, knowing, trusting that the God who rescued the Israelites out of Egypt will come to our rescue, God will move. Because God is all-powerful and he loves you. He loves you more than you love yourself, and he cares about you, and he wants you to be free. He doesn't want you to be in bondage anymore. He wants you to be able to experience his presence in your life. Now, here's the hard part. I know if you're thinking, didn't we already do the hard part? No, we didn't. Here's the hard part. I wish I could say that when the Israelites were freed from Egypt, that they were freed from all their troubles and they got to stroll into the promised land and get their milk and their honey, which apparently was appealing to them, and I don't find very appealing. But that isn't what happened. The Israelites left Egypt and they went into the wilderness. And they were hardly out of Egypt before trouble started mounting around them again. If you look at Exodus 14. Flip over to chapter 14, verse 10. The Israelites are camped by the Red Sea, and Pharaoh changes his mind again, so he's coming after them. And he has all of his armies with them. It says in chapter 10, as Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, leave us alone? Let us serve the Egyptians. It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. They were hardly out of Egypt, and they already want to go back because the trouble that was mounting around them. I remember when I made the decision to leave architecture school to do this whole pastor thing. It was really probably the hardest decision I ever had to make in my life. And it was something that God's grace alone allowed me to do. But I remember a few years into that journey, I was just going through a really, really, really tough time. And I kind of went through this bout of depression, and then my mom died, and then my girlfriend had cancer, and then my family was starting to fall apart, and they were all at each other's throats. And I was just, I was sitting with a friend in the lobby of the dorm, and I was just like, God, what are you doing? Why did you bring me out here to die? My spirit was broken, I was crushed. And then I had this 10-second reprieve from my self-absorption, and I saw something. I saw what I was missing, and I saw what the Israelites were missing. Flip back a page, or probably back a page, to Exodus 13, verse 20. After leaving Succoth, they camped at Etham on the edge of the desert. By day, the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so that they could travel by day or night. Neither the pillar of cloud by day nor the pillar of fire by night left its place in front of the people. What I was missing and what the Israelites were missing is that when God led us out of bondage, we might have been in the wilderness, but the very presence of God was with us, guiding us, comforting us, leading us, loving us. And I tell you what, no matter what troubles might come your way, no matter what it is that mounts around you, when the presence of God is with you, guiding you and comforting you like this, there is nothing sweeter. You can actually withstand anything when God goes before you, fighting your battles for you. And the Israelites will again and again, as they're going through the wilderness, complain about different things. And every time God will show up and save them because he loves them. And when they're freed from the Egyptians, God can be present with them. And there is nothing sweeter. If you've never experienced this closeness with God, I wish I could describe it to you, but it's like trying to describe music to a deaf person. I mean, it's something that you have to experience, but it's this transcendent sort of experience. This is what allows St. Paul, to say that he can rejoice in his sufferings. This is what allows him to be singing praises to God when he's in prison. This is why James can consider it pure joy when he's faced with trials, because there are no other gods enslaving them. And the one true God, the great I Am, is present with them, comforting them, bringing them joy and peace and love. And this is what is available to all of us if we can step out in faith, trusting that God wants to free us from the gods that enslave us. Please pray with me. God, we thank you for being the God who is, the God who is all-powerful, the God who is all-loving. We thank you that we can step out in faith, and that you, in your love and your mercy and in your grace, you will catch us when we fall. You will fight the battles for us that we need to fight in our lives if we trust you, if we walk in obedience to your ways, God. I pray that you will be near us, that your presence will go before us in the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire, guiding us, leading us, and that we'll be able to feel your presence in our lives. Free us from the bondage. Free us from the false gods that enslave us, God. We love you and we trust you. In Jesus' name, amen.